Yes, hello, hello. So very, very happy to have you at the attending the I3h seminar, and we are delighted to welcome today Professor James Robinson to talk about innovation in industrial policy in the life sciences, a huge topic worldwide, European-wide, Belgian-wide, and so on. So, and he's a perfect expert to talk about that. James is the Leonard Schaefer Professor of Health Economics and Division Head, Health Policy and Management at the School of Public Health of the University of California, Berkeley. He does a lot of research on the biotechnology, medical device, insurance, and healthcare delivery sectors. He has published very widely, including 3 books and 150 papers, peer-reviewed journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and Health Affairs. He teaches in Berkeley classes on public policy, health insurance, and the economics of the life science industry. And he serves on a variety of professional advisory boards and is invited to give speeches by pharmaceutical and technology firms, health insurance plans, hospitals, physicians' organizations, universities, and public agencies. And he's a real expert on these types of topics, which are hugely important for us. So thanks a lot for coming to enlighten us.
Great. Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm gonna stand because when I talk, I like to just get my energy. If that's okay. That works with the technology. And what I thought that I would do today is share some of my thinking of what is for me an emerging area of research activity, which is in the area of industrial policy, as distinct from most of my econometric research has been in the area of pricing issues and payment methods that I work in, and I'm happy to talk about those topics. But I thought I would talk about industrial policy in the life sciences because it's a hot issue policy and wise and politically in the United States, and also I believe in Europe. And so I am very keen on getting feedback. This is not something where I want you to not say anything until I'm done speaking. This is a good good topic for us to be interactive because we're all kind of groping our way about it. And I would say, just as to put from a context, the field of health economics and health policy research over the past couple of decades that I've been involved in it has been dominated by the issue that healthcare costs are too high, prices are too high, budget impact is too severe, and the issue is how do we manage all that while still having access. And that's absolutely a real issue. Budget impact, budgets are always important. But in recent years, there's been a growing appreciation for the role of the life sciences, drugs, devices, digital therapeutics, diagnostics as a component of the knowledge-based industry of the future. And it is a sector that has a value for society somewhat in addition to or separate from the impact it has on the individual patient. And now that goes, so now is under the umbrella of industrial policy, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic, and now in the United States, to some extent, I believe in Europe, huge concern about competition from China in particular, and we don't want to see all of the technology-based industries move to China, which they're doing. I mean, they're very clearly moving, and the implications of that for the economy, for military applications, et cetera. So that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. If this works, guess what?
You need to click on the window, touch the screen.
I mean, I can just do that.
No, it's a touch screen. You just touch a screen.
Is this a touch screen?
Exactly. No, don't try to click. See it works.
Oh, okay. Good. This is just me. Just background. By the way, anybody that wants a copy of these slides, ask me on me. So I'm going to talk at a fair lot. Some of this you all, it's going to be very straightforward, very well known to you, but I'm going to talk about the special features of innovation that require public policy support. And so one of my things I'll get to in a second is the traditional policy paradigm in the United States, less so in other countries, has been that the government's role should be in providing the infrastructure of innovation, education, basic science, etc. But the private sector should fund all product development, commercialization, manufacturing, distribution. So this is the division of labor, and that is what's eroded. And so there's certain features of it that require public policy, and will get us into industrial policy. First mover advantages, the firms that achieve large scale and scope can get on this pathway of improvements in performance and reductions in cost, which is difficult for others to match. We see that as industries have moved, for example, to China, you can't get back in. You know, once you lose, once the United States has lost, all flat screens are now made in China. You can't build the iPhone in America anymore. It's not possible. You don't have the supply chain, and the firms in China are so much better now. They're so much bigger. They're so diversified. Network effects, the value, obviously the value of these platforms grows with the number of users, and spillover effect. So these are all features which raise the issue about whether there is a special policy justification for public support of certain industries. Historically, that goes under the name of infant industry support. In fact, that goes back to that. Secondly, there's competition not only among firms, but among nations. This is also something that your standard economic model does not really have a role for. The idea is that. And that just the fact is that innovation and its benefits have moved strongly from Europe and the US to the small Asian tigers like Singapore and Korea, and now to China. And it's worth thinking just for a second about comparative advantage. If Taiwan has the world dominant semiconductor industry, it's obviously not because of any special comparative advantage in natural resources or in labor costs or in anything, right? So you cannot get to these factors. The only reason that explains the role, the success of the Asian countries in the tech industries is industrial policy, is governmental policy, and it's been very successful. It has to be said. Doesn't mean that somebody else can imitate it, that any other country could become the next Taiwan just by doing what Taiwan did. But oh my God, did Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Japan have really figured it out? Yeah.
So they invented the export model of industrial policy, right?
Well, you could say it actually dates back to, you know, the origins of the English industrial revolution. Is also an export-oriented model. But they really, after World War II, it's really an amazing story that these countries, which were like Taiwan or Hong Kong or South Korea, completely destroyed. There wasn't anything standing in South Korea after the Korean War, right? Nothing. And now look at them. Right.
So is the success only this reinvention of industrial policy, so switching from infant industry to export driven, that if I understand the history correctly, led the Washington Consensus in the 19th, or did they do something new since then?
No, they didn't go Washington Consensus. They went in government-led industrial development, and the traditional Washington, which you often referred to as Washington Consensus, is that the private sector should be primary in the economy, and the public sector should just do like basic science and education. That they never followed that, and America did follow it. And the lesson of history is that America lost. Okay, as the same thing with Europe. You know, Europe is also facing the risk of a deindustrialization in the high-tech industries. That goes for artificial intelligence, it goes for semiconductor, it goes to batteries, and now there's real worry of losing those industries. So,
by the way, next to, it's not always industrial policy. It's the fact that at some point, this is what economists call hysteresis. So current conditions influence the future. You just get really very good at doing something, and then you attract talent, and there are
right. Once you get going,
Silicon Valley, is that industrial policy? The fact that in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, you have all the biotech. There are also market forces towards concentration alike. And so I guess in the case of Taiwan, for some reason, they got pretty good at semiconductors and they keep working on it. In Belgium, you have Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical, which is Janssen. At some level, we are nice to pharma industry, but it's not just that.
Well, the main argument, this is the infinite industry argument is that yes, there's all of these things. Once they get going, they have a momentum, but you need to get them going in the first place. And even Silicon Valley, the origins of Silicon Valley is all military. I mean, that's where it comes from. All the original breakthroughs, all financed by the military. It's not the free private sector. It's really the military. It's like DARPA kind of.
I wish.
Okay. All right. So then the instruments of the innovation policy are really three buckets in my way I look at it. Push grants to fund science research, but also commercialization. You see that in COVID, big change. Pull incentives for a successful, the rewards for successful innovation. Push funds R&D regardless of success. Pull does not fund R&D, only funds success. And then the regulatory environment, which includes FDA authorization, antitrust, data privacy, and everything else, has obviously an impact on. And these things could be, these called a regulation. Often it's not been designed with innovation in mind. So, for example, in antitrust in the United States, and the antitrust authorities tend to look at market shares inside the United States, which you can say, but that's crazy. You should look at global market shares. And so if they break up, AT&T or IBM or whatever, there's been a whole number of the big companies break up, and then 10 years later, 15 years later, it's dominated by a Chinese company or a Japanese.
Is there a consensus about the effectiveness of the
I don't think that people view them as alternatives, but as complements. And so it's a design, what's the right design? And so we were talking earlier about the Orphan Drug Act. Orphan Drug actually has a combination of push and pull. Yep. So it's an interesting area of research, or at least experimentation. Which combinations work well? They might work differently for something like orphan drug than for COVID versus blockbuster versus rare versus implantable devices versus. All right, so industrial policy, the old and the new. The traditional US framework, what I call the division of labor, which is the public sector funds the infrastructure of innovation and basic research, and the private sector funds product development and commercialization. Yes?
I just want to ask you the policy companies. Do you call strategic state ownership also part of the space?
Yes, that would be yes, certainly. If you have nationalized, you could either, if I'm understanding you correctly, one could say we'll either give grants to this private company, governmental grants, or the government will buy the company altogether. Those would be it raises a series of other issues. Very little, as a general, just as a political philosophy, there is, I'm not even sure, possibly in some aspects of the military, but I don't even think so. I think that they're these companies that live on government grants, that it's purely government funded, but it's still private. Yeah. Whereas obviously in Europe, there's been much more of experimentation, nationalized. So I understand. Anyway, other nations never really accepted this division of labor. European countries have always supported their industrial champions, particularly France or something. They get a lot.
Right.
And then the Asian countries and now China are obviously China does not accept this division of labor at all. Now, there is a private sector in China, but China's view of the private sector is it works for the public sector. And that's what its role is. It's not. Yeah.
Let me qualify it. I totally agree with Asia versus the US. The EU is the only jurisdiction in the world that has so-called state aid control.
As what?
State aid control. So in the US, when BMW wants to build a plant, or Amazon or whatever, they can do an auction for state money. In the EU, it's completely prevented. They think that, the EU is there to enforce, the Commission is there to enforce the single market, and they hate the idea of a company getting national money because it will be a competitive disadvantage of an EU company in another. So there are few markets where public money can flow like that. One of them, I think, is aircraft, because there is only one European company, which is Airbus. And there you can fiddle. They will deny it, but it's true. But in a sense, I think I would qualify concerning the EU nations. Of course, the French will like to say, but it's not really working that well.
Yeah, you have to go sector by sector and see what is the extent of public money being invested historically in the semiconductor sector, for example, or even there's always the problem with this of industrial policy is the fear is that the government will invest its money in declining industries.
Picking the wrong winners.
That's right, because those are the ones without the jobs. And those are, and so bailing out Alitalia or bailing out, whomever, whereas in fact they should be investing in the startup sector. That's the one. Okay, this is just a report we just showed. Incredible. This was looking across 4 countries: Germany, Italy, Canada, and the U.S. Just the variation. Any kind of set of indexes is going to be limited by the data, but a huge variation in the different dimensions of the high-tech knowledge economy capacity, both within countries as well as across countries. You see in the United States, it's very concentrated, California, the coasts, the 2 coasts. And then in Germany, it's the same thing. It's in the south and in the west. In Italy, it's in the north. There's just huge variations in technological and where the tech industries are, where the innovation happens. And it's due to a combination of just historical accident, but then also the big question from a public policy perspective is, can policy influence this?
Concentration forces.
Yeah, well, regional spillover effects are clearly huge, and we don't know exactly, but it's partly the mobility, like Silicon Valley, mobility of people across companies, but also the supportive, like in Massachusetts, they have a huge state governmental support for the biotech sector. They've recognized that's one thing they want to win at biotech, and so they'll support it.
They tried IT but failed.
Yeah, so every country in the world is trying to figure out how to create its own version of startup center, Silicon Valley and wherever, everybody wants that. This is just kind of a miscellaneous slide. There's a foundation that puts out this index of comparing countries' healthcare systems across multiple dimensions, and then they rank them based on their total score. And the U.S. Ranks very high on its innovation, science and technology, by far the highest, but because we spend so much money, very inefficient healthcare system, we rank very low. They're measured of fiscal sustainability as spending divided by GDP. And so the US looks terrible on that. This is kind of interesting, looking at you could pick your favorite country and see how it ranks, and they get to decide this foundation, how they want to score things. But it's that when there's discussions of, I know the US healthcare system in America, the Americans love criticizing the American healthcare system. It's the number one thing people like to do in their work in health policy. And there's much to criticize, but they tend to ignore the innovation ecosystem, which is very strong in the States. So I would say we have an inefficient delivery system and a very efficient innovation system. And so the total is.
Also, I think the US, what people say, look, it's very costly, which is true. And then the overall indicators are not that great, life expectancy, but that's not necessarily because of the healthcare system.
Right.
So I 20 years ago, there was somebody presenting a research here saying that the US had at the time, the highest life expectancy conditional on being alive at 60.
Right.
I don't know whether it's still true, but
clearly the measuring or evaluating the effectiveness of the healthcare system based on population morbidity and mortality is difficult because of the social determinants of health dominate the medical care influence on. So I'm going to talk about horizontal industrial policy and vertical industrial policy. Horizontal industrial policy really is about how do you support research universities and science education, and the transition we see now with COVID. COVID vaccines, the underlying technology of COVID was funded by the NIH using the NIH model. The NIH model is give money to scientists and let them follow their research wherever it leads them. That's the basic. The DARPA model is, no, the payer decides what they want, and then the researchers produce that. And it turned out that the DARPA model works really well for certain things, and because it can be really to solve these needs as opposed to basic science or follow the whatever is the publishable research these days in that particular field.
By the way, what do you think about this view, which you hear, that in terms of investigator-initiated research funding, the NIH is not high risk, high gain enough, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute is better? Maybe it's just complementary, or what's your view on that?
Well, it's just to explain that the NIH, which is the #1 leading scientific funding agency in the world by far, gives most of its money out in the form of peer-reviewed grants, which are competitive peer-reviewed grants, which in practice end up going to through peer-reviewed panels to established scholars, scientists in major universities. And so the criticism is that it therefore underfunds high-risk, younger people in secondary institutions which might be more innovative, and that's bad. So that's the criticism.
Kathleen Carrico.
Pardon?
Kathleen Carrico, who was the researcher who was working on the mRNA and
yeah, that's right. You can find examples. Of course, you can also find examples where NIH funded really fabulous breakthrough stuff. So I view, I'll give you, there's the easy answer and then there's the weasel answer. Okay, the easy answer is that yes, the NIH model is rather conservative. And so it needs to be complemented by other models, which I actually am more like this DARPA model. That we have these needs, COVID vaccine, that's what we want. We don't want you to follow your science, we want COVID vaccine. So that's the easy answer. The weasel answer or whatever it is, well, how would you split the total? You know what I mean? What's the trade-off? And should we, I think that the pressure is on now the NIH to have more of its research be more translational, to be more, you can really see it's directly affecting outcomes, health outcomes in the short term. It's not just publishing more obscure papers in obscure scientific journals. And people can debate both sides of that.
No, I agree with that. In a sense, you could argue that what the people, how we use supporters say is that part of the NIH model is already too close to DARPA, and some of it, you should take off some of the money and really take more risk because, peers can also be conservative.
Yeah, well, they are conservative. Yeah, that's right. So
I guess the MacArthur Foundation is also
right. So
more,
it's
but anyway.
easier for not-for-profit foundations or philanthropists, capitalists, to fund high-risk things because if they lose their money, if they fund something that has completely wasted money, but if the government wastes it, then it's in the newspaper and they get some more. Yes.
NIH is really a push version of the industrial policy.
Yes.
How is DARPA?
DARPA would be also, well, DARPA was actually a mixture of things. DARPA's mostly pushes, mostly gives commercialization grants. What's the key thing about DARPA is that it's funding products and technologies that are close to products. It's not basic science. So the DARPA model really is taking push and extending it beyond, well, the traditional division of labor was government funds the R, industry funds the D of R&D. That's the traditional model. DARPA brings the government into funding the D. And I actually think that's the number one thing that's happening in industrial policy in the United States. And that's the number one thing that China's doing, is governmental funds for product development. It doesn't have to be done by DARPA, but that's the basic idea.
But very much push.
But it's push. Now, there is also a pull dimension, for example, with COVID vaccine. There was they gave a lot of money and push both for product development and manufacturing capability, but then they also had these advanced market commitments and procurement policy. So I believe that procurement policy is also part of innovation policy, but it's on the pull side.
By the way, you mentioned DARPA and not BARDA. Is BARDA like DARPA but for biotech or?
Yeah, I am not that clear on exactly what BARDA does. DARPA is DARPA, it's defense. DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Projects. And DARPA's, just for those of you that aren't familiar with DARPA, DARPA is a governmental thing that was created back several decades ago when we were afraid of the Soviets and all that. And it funds it's been unbelievably successful. DARPA is who funded the internet, GPS, flat screens. Most of the things that we take for granted comes out of military applications. So it really just shows that, wow, the government, when it's got a pretty clear goal, like a military goal, it can really pick winners, it can really do things. And it came out again with COVID. When the goal was clear, we want vaccines, and we want them as soon as possible, that kind of clarified things, and they were successful on. Now, they built on the underlying science, which had been funded by the NIH for decades.
The BARDA, since they funded, they concentrated on 6 projects, 2 firms each for 3 technologies, US, non-US, and 5 out of the 6 so far have been authorized. Maybe only 4 in the US because AstraZeneca wasn't. But the only one, by the way, that hasn't been funded yet is by an alliance between 2 of the top 4 producers of vaccines in the world, Sanofi and GSK. Yeah. And even Pfizer and Merck Sharp and Dohme also, but they didn't even get money. And Pfizer only came after BioNTech, which did get the BARDA money. So it's interesting from the point of view of, I'm all in favor of, let's say, mission-oriented DARPA-style things, but let's not concentrate on big incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, apparently, and I'm not a DARPA expert, but apparently DARPA's model is to fund multiple technologies and let them compete, sort of like an innovation race. That's standard. That was standard DARPA, and it turned out to be a good decision in retrospect. Although you could say in prospect, oh wow, they're gonna waste all this money. They're just funding all these different things, but they didn't know. So supporting that, support the regulatory environment. We talked a little bit about this. And then financial support for high-risk, long-term R&D investment. And this is both in the form of basically tax incentives, like R&D tax credits, public investment, equity investment, that we don't do that in the United States, but it is a rising thing. And then subsidized credit is also used very heavily in some European countries, and in Israel, by the way, is very active funding through the banks, as is Germany. German banking system is actually a big part of the German technological infrastructure.
So you mean by public equity investment, you mean that the states, Israel and China, takes equity stakes
Yes.
in company?
Yes. Yeah.
So they get part of the upside.
They get part of the upside and governance, a certain amount of role of governance. It's distinct from a flat out grant. Historical countries tried to support their champion companies. Countries tried to support their companies by giving them grants. And the problem with grants can be, as an NIH, a lack of accountability. And an equity stake, where you have first of all, you get a return on investment. It's going to be a below market return because it's invested for the goal. Like in China, the public equity investment companies, they are clear that their rate of return will be less than the market because they invest in things which have a high social return, which is going to be a spillover in terms of technological development. That's the goal. But the private return is also good as a measure of that they're actually not squandering this money. So, but that is from a U.S. perspective, like, wow, who's gonna manage that, and who's gonna, is this? We don't want, just if you think about it for just a moment, you say, wow, that could be all kinds of opportunity for favoritism, fraud. We'll invest it in the companies in my home state.
So that is not interfere too much.
Well, let's put it this way. This talk, if you've already got the mood of this, is favorable towards industrial policy, active industrial policy. But I am got some cautions. Whereas if you see, you read, who's your famous Mariana Mazzucato, is that her? She's like all in, but doesn't ask her about the potential for inefficient overinvestment, for example. Like right now, we could imagine everybody's investing in semiconductors. So now apparently we've got a global glut of semiconductor capacity already. And you can see that in the vaccine domain. Do we really want to have everybody subsidizing new vaccine development? Every country in the world, that would be inefficient. So I've got a paper on this, which is still in draft form. I'd be very happy to send it to anybody, which raises some of these worries. There's a number of worries, and I don't have a way of deciding, do the worries outweigh the benefits or not? I think that I would say, starting from where the US is, that looking at the examples of Korea and Taiwan, and then looking at what China's doing, you see that moving somewhat in this direction is a winner. That the worries are there, you have to think about it. And even in China, they've got fraud, they've got overinvestment, they've got regional, they got these regional investment funds that want to just fund in the region, and they've got problems. But still,
By the way, when you talk about China, there has been a break with the current leader, who has been, put it this way, the relationship between the US and China is not as good today as it was 10, 15 years ago, which of course affects because one thing China did next to investing in strategic policy was what everybody was kind of doing in the 1980s, which was to say, look, we want to sell here, it will help if you produce here. Therefore, Apple, for example, China is the manufacturing leader in the world, probably because everybody wanted it. And now, of course, with the new environment, press COVID and the like, you hear that Apple is shifting some of its stuff to India. I think that, and my guess is that when you see also the US saying, look, you cannot do that technology and so on. So I think this will change a fair amount. Of
Well, the military or geopolitical dimensions are affecting all this, but it is very clear. This is the Chinese strategy. We are going to subsidize our local companies. We're going to say for all the four companies, if you want to sell in China, you have to have a joint venture with the Chinese companies. You have to share your intellectual property with them. Then after they grow up their scale, at that point, you're excluded from the Chinese market. Then the companies grow, and then they become export oriented. And so then you will be buying all your product from China. You know, it's like right now with Foxconn, or whatever, there's no production in the, Silicon Valley, which created silicon, there's no production of silicon's products anymore. It's all in China and in Taiwan and in Korea, which is pretty amazing. And once you fall behind,
some of the production was returned to the US.
so now they're trying to subsidize it to build with all these new incentive programs. So now they are building new plants in the United States, semiconductor plants, but it's because of government policy, which the true libertarians, they don't like that. They don't like the government telling companies.
They want to protect China.
Right. Okay. So, and I want to keep time passing. So I look at we can spend all afternoon talking about this, but I look at the life sciences ecosystem as having three major parts to it. The research universities and laboratories, their needs, that's where the basic, life sciences are very connected to the university, more than the information technology. The second is the entrepreneurial startups and scale-ups, and the third is the large companies. And each of the three is actually very important. You can't do without one of them. Most countries outside of the US, like in Europe, are strong on the research universities. Europe has a lot of great science, and they have some leading big companies. It's this middle category which has been hard to develop. The US has had a strong, because of Silicon Valley and all that, startup culture. The problem with the startups is what we call the scale-up issue. That a startup is economically valuable, not when it's a startup and it's got 15 or 30 workers, but when it goes from 30 to 3,000 to 300,000. You know, it goes to Google, when it comes to Google. And that, the funding, the crossing what's called the valley of death of getting a startup to get to scale up is where there's been a big lack of finance. And that's where public finance enters.
I mean, it's one of the big strengths of the US, that even European startups, if they want to scale up, they need to go to the US because we have a more unified market. So you have market size in the US. It's very hard to get market size in Europe.
There's a variety of reasons. Yes, there's good venture capital in America, but venture capital only is willing to finance somewhat capital light software industries, capital intensive like batteries, cars, semiconductor. It's just too much money for venture, too long of a payoff. So the reason they come to the US is to sell in the market. But increasingly for the hardware companies, they go to Korea or they go to Japan. That's where even the American ones, once they get up to a certain scale, they have to go to Asia to go to the next level. That's where it's a huge.
Because you know there is an overwhelming majority of scale-ups which happen in the US and not
in the IT sector. In the IT sector.
And not in healthcare?
Well, yes, healthcare has been. So there's a general thing, which is that the US venture capital ecosystem is good for funding capital light investments like software, but not capital intensive like electric batteries. The counterexample to that is the life sciences. That obviously we have a huge success in biotech and medical devices. And the question is, well, why? Well, the answer is, in my my view, is because the prices in the US market have been so high, they've supported it. But if the prices get squeezed, as we were talking about earlier in the US market, that funding source will go away, and then the startups will increasingly move to Asia. And so I believe that we see it in the States right now. No, but the funding, the push funding is high. Everybody still wants to sell in America to the extent they want to sell everywhere, but they need to get the resources somewhere. And what I3h is let me step back. Part of what happened in the US. The US industrial policy is being driven by three things in the US, in my view. First of all, I call them hope, anger, and fear. Hope is that there's a hope that the government policy, when done well, can be successful. And this really comes out of the COVID experience. That BARDA and OWS, they tried to do something and they did it. Huge, big success, incontrovertible. It was the public sector that created those, not the private sector. So that's the hope. The anger is anger at the pricing. I think that the traditional way of funding R&D in the States through high drug prices and profits is just become so politically unpopular among people that one way or another it's being squeezed. I think it's more in the private sector than in the public sector, but in the public sector there's been legislation to allow Medicare to negotiate lower prices. And so that's the second, that's the anger. And the fear is China. It's bipartisan. It's President Biden. It's Donald Trump. It's the Republicans. It's the Democrats. There's this fear that we've already lost so many of the traditional technologies which were created in the U.S. now only exist. There's only production in Asia, and the key ones now are artificial intelligence, electric batteries and everything that goes with that for alternative energy, and life sciences, drugs, and issues like that.
By the way, Europe thinks that it is collateral damage of this new strategy, because some of the relocation of industry will also be from Europe, especially today with the high energy prices.
Yes, absolutely. One of the there's two aspects of that. So there's a fear that the U.S. incentives will come at the expense of Europe, and in the short term, that's what happened. So one could say, and I would say that really what the U.S. really wants to do, if fear of China is the number one driver ultimately, then it should coordinate with the other Europe, Canada, Australia, around industrial policy, not just military policy, but industrial policy. And then one of the problems of one of the criticisms of industrial policy is that it can unleash mercantilism, and that then we are China, Europe's been helping its industry more than the U.S. Now we're overbidding that. Now China, Europe's got to increase, just like with tax reductions, and then even within Europe, there's this thing about Germany versus it's a challenge. So yes, this was just an example. For those of you that follow this stuff, these are just the companies that got money from OWS. So these are massive investments by the government in private pharmaceutical companies under the COVID, and the different components of it. Some was product development, some was in clinical trials, some was create manufacturing capacity, and some of it was procurement contracts for when were signed before the products were invented, if you will. So anyway, lots of money went into COVID. It was all public money. The COVID vaccines were a success of the public sector, public investment. So it's a great Mazzucato. There's a great article by a guy by the name of David Adler, the details of how it was all done. It's very good, very interesting. So that's an example. Here's another example. This is outside of healthcare. This is a U.S. focused talk. I'm sorry. Around semiconductors. Semiconductor is the heart of the debate, national, global debate around industrial policy, because semiconductors create chips which run everything, absolutely everything, all transportation, not only just computers, all everything. And it's moved from the US and Europe to Asia. Big market share right now, it's Taiwan and Korea. And China is rapidly growing. So the CHIPS Act, which was just passed this past year, was a huge payment by US government in grants and various kinds of tax credit for domestic US chip capacity. So that's what's bringing these plants back to the US, Intel, but also TSMC, et cetera. And it was very political. China's in lobbies. And the one thing about America is that you're allowed to lobby on education, even if you're a foreign country, on legislation. So they were out there lobbying against it. So that's it. But it's an example to me of Biden is very much in it. They're going to go through industry by industry in the technology industries. And now no one's talking about doing this in the steel industry or the textile industry or the restaurant industry or the hotel industry. They're talking about, the tech sector. Here is for life sciences, ARPA, or I3h, is Advanced Research Projects Administration for Health. That's what ARPA-H stands for. Was created right on the DARPA model to promote domestic product development in the life sciences. So it's very much US-based product development. But remember, the NIH funds science. They don't fund the development of pills and injections and vaccines, and they fund science. Whereas ARPA, which is technically part of NIH, but is going to be funding product development, and we will see whether they ever get enough funding to do a major thing or a minor thing. But this is something, ARPA money could replace pharmaceutical profits as a source of R&D investment, partially. To me, it's another signal in the wind.
My understanding of the game is that any product deployment, not development, deployment again, requires semiconductors. But you need a network distribution, you need massive scale to produce, etc. So I don't see how it could replace a company profits. In the end, once you look with vaccines, we have the technology to produce them, and we still need Pfizer in the end.
Right. Well, once again, think about my three-part organizational ecosystem: university, startup, big company. Big companies are always going to be needed for the manufacturing because of scale, economies, and distribution. But the ARPA is not really trying to eliminate profits. ARPA is really to fund the scale up. It's really that funding that entrepreneurial or the third sector. That's what needs the money.
So scale up, including production.
Well, obviously it blurs together, but scale up to the point where you have there's apparently a lot of promising technologies, molecules and device stuff that don't get from the startups to the big companies, because the big companies won't buy it because it's still got too much risk in it. It's still underdeveloped. And so they need the money to get them to the point where they can either be bought by the big companies, or we would like to have, frankly, a few more big companies. You know what I mean? If BioNTech and Moderna.
Do you think? So it would be great if you need to go to, I don't need to go through the big 5 or 10 in order to get to market. But otherwise, it's just more government money, so the big companies can stop investing. Just take the winners.
Well, the big companies. Yeah, well, the big government, the big companies, remember, to feed their pipeline, they need products to distribute. and they buy those products.
Now it would be funded by half, but-
Right, well, but that then in a competitive world will, if there's more products, then the price of them will go down. And I mean, there's a whole nother issue about the prices of products that the big companies can charge. We can talk about that. That's a separate issue. But then we're trying to feed their pipeline. Okay. Because they, in the past, the big companies developed a lot of new products. Now, today, they don't, for all kinds of complex reasons. Very few major drugs are developed by the internal laboratories of big pharma. Most of them are done by startups right next to the university. And most companies, all the startups are right around Harvard, MIT, or they're right around UCSF.
Aren't we exactly that? Giving them products almost for free? They cut down on R&D and increase.
Well,
quantity.
let's put it this way. I wouldn't have any problem with giving them products for free. And then their job is to manufacture and distribute efficiently, right? They should then price their products only sufficient to cover manufacturing and distribution because they didn't. Okay.
They get the patents for the
No.
the-
And so that's a whole issue about pricing strategy, pricing policy, say. And prices come from the interaction of the buyers and the sellers. These are the sellers we're talking about now, the life sciences corporations. The buyers are the governmental programs and the private insurance companies that buy, that pay for them. And they will always try to get the lowest price.
I don't get that.
Well, I mean, this is a whole other issue about whether prices are too high or too low in the pharmaceutical sector, and especially if you look across domains. You can, if they're too low, there's going to be shortages. If it's too high, there's going to be an influx of investment because people want access to monopoly profits that are high. And what's going on out there? Do we see overinvestment or underinvestment in biotech in the world? And that's my measure of whether the prices and profits are high or low, is the flow of capital. So, and this is sort of a side conversation. Well, let's just park that issue. Pricing policy is very important. But the fact that the big companies don't develop their own products and we give it to them or we subsidize the product by itself is not a problem. You could just say, because they're like a contract manufacturer. You could even have a different pricing model, which we say, we'll own the product. We'll pay you to manufacture it and pay you to distribute it. But we own it.
That's the Bill Gates Bill & Melinda Foundation strategy for vaccine production.
Yeah, that's right. So there's different versions of that, and is that the right way? And different kinds of incentives. It's good organizational theory. Where's our time?
Just there are 35 minutes left.
Okay.
There is one question, but not directly related to what you're saying now, so we can have it at the end. By the way, there are 15 people online, so questions are welcome.
Sure.
Maybe,
well, I would say I'm happy. Let me just see. Well, I don't remember what I still have. Okay. Okay. So what I was going to do now is talk about some of the problems of industrial policy problems and political problems. But I'm very happy to pause and to take questions from. I'm not watching online, so I don't know what or any of you that have.
The question is, how should Belgium act in order to keep attracting innovation in our country? And you can also replace Belgium by Europe. It's also true. For example, gene therapy facilities are often located in the US, and thus patient cells have to be flown over and back. I guess connected to what you're saying is that indeed there is a whole chain which is needed. And the question is to what extent, I would generalize the question saying, to what extent do we need a complete ecosystem or whether, of course, it has to do with the with how cooperative we are across the Atlantic. But I do think that indeed one thing that often happens is you have some disputes. So Belgium is not bad at all in health, but then you have some US companies coming doing their shopping over some successful biotech companies, and then it's not a problem, not a problem. I guess this example there is the link between indeed innovation and then the therapies.
Okay, well, there was a number of components of that. The fact that corporations buy startups in different countries that cuts both ways. Major European pharma companies, Roche, Sanofi, they exist because they bought American biotech company, right? So that's
Right.
It cuts both ways. I would just simplify and say, what would be my advice to the European life sciences industrial policy?
Okay, very good.
And as I look at Europe, I see, well, first of all, I would say Europe has got to act as Europe. The future of Belgium as an independent player in the global market is just like, you just can't, okay? So all these barriers between the different European countries, when it comes to data privacy, when it comes to all, is from an outsider's perspective, is dysfunctional. Europe combined is big, sophisticated, to be a major player, right? As you know, you look at the world, there's only three major hubs. There's China, the US, and Europe. Europe needs to act that way. So I don't know what to say.
Of course, no, Europe is without the UK, and even without Switzerland to some extent, and therefore that's a problem.
It is a problem, and then yeah, it's a huge problem, and I don't have a solution for it. But anyway, that needs to happen. The other question is where to intervene. And my perception, this is just an outsider's perception, is that the weak spot in the European industrial ecosystem is in the third sector, the startup sector, and the scale-up half of the startup sector. You get a lot of good universities, a lot of great startup, a lot of entrepreneurial students that do great things, but then they get out and they find they can't get the capital, and they can't get the advice and the expertise even to grow, and then they move to the United States, or then eventually they go, they bring real money, they go to Korea. And so it's in that domain, and the work needs to happen. And what are the components of that? I give all this free advice, okay? The components of that are first part financial. There needs to be funding mechanisms for this, both at the little startup level and at the scale-up level. Maybe at the scale, this is happening. You know, in England, and they have these industrial investment funds, which apparently are not that bad at picking winners. At the entrepreneurial level, I find, and I have a perception, this may or may not be true. I have a perception that in some European countries like France and Italy, there is a historical concern or worry that the universities should not be too close to industry. That will lead to conflicts of interest, contamination, financial stuff, and it's bad. And that the university should be focused on knowledge and training and students, and then the industry profits. And they're really, you can find all kinds of examples of inappropriate influence. Okay? But generally, I think that is a really bad thing. I think that the success of the US ecosystem has been the fluidity of between the university and the commercial sector, and that students can go in sciences or whatever, they go into industry, and then they come back, and you have these startups which have one foot in industry and one foot in university. And in my students, I'm not in the sciences, I'm in business management. The students go back and forth into the private sector and the public sector, the startup sector, the market. It's very, we have a lot of guest speakers from the startups and from big industry in my area. It's Genentech is the biggest biotech company in the Bay Area, San Francisco Roche. They're, you know, very active on campus. They hire our students. So a lot of our students go. So it's a very productive, fluid world, and I think it's good for the university, and I think it's good for the professors that keep us kind of real world oriented, and it's good for the students' jobs. You know, we get all of our students get multiple job offers. I mean, there's like a no problem for the labor force in health, you know, the health management stuff because of this. And that's why we've got so many startups. It's like Berkeley, San Francisco is just zillions. Now biggest is the digital startups of all, digital health. It's the sexiest things. That's what students are, you know, it's good. So I think that the university, because I'm a university person, the university world needs to change somewhat in Europe, become a little bit more fluid, a little bit more. That's just my unsolicited. Well, actually, you did solicit it, but there you go. That's my advice. Whoever was that on because the university, you know, the irony is Europe is paying for the research, supporting the universities, and not getting the commercial return on that investment. That's wrong. That's not smart. So how do you get a return on investment of these students? I mean, it's sad. I get up at Berkeley, these students that come from Italy, they want to come to Berkeley because why do they want to come see me? Actually, what they want is a job in the Bay Area. That's what they really want. And I'm a way to get there. And that's a brain drain. We shouldn't be getting the best students from Italy coming to America. They should be staying in Italy and making things happen.
Very interrupting too much, you just let me know. But another aspect is also this very local, mentioning that as a risk, very local perception of what's good or bad. And the US is better also at having these big centers, for saying the Bay Area, that does not happen anywhere. And so if you start with these things, we can have champions. And now a country that we are champion means you're not funding the other universities.
Yeah, that's hard.
Therefore, we are peppering money all around. And that's another hurdle beyond the fluidity that you were mentioning. In Belgium, I see it's, you know, it's becoming more natural.
Yes, good.
Urbana is surrounded by startups as well, and more partners in biotech. We really here as
Science parks.
We start a spin-off. There's a spin-off center.
Incubators and all that.
Exactly.
No.
What does not happen is to concentrate, focus the money on where it works.
Yeah.
If you have some money going here, then you need to compensate the others.
It's a real problem, and I don't have the solution for it. The same thing we see is that if you really want to have a world-leading technology sector, what you ought to do is put all your money in Boston and San Francisco, not in the middle of the country. But politically, you know, you've got to not only politically, but from an equity perspective or whatever, you want to bring the rest of the, you know, so that, and it's even worse in Europe because, you know, if you have a leading center in Belgium, then, you know, they'll say, well, why don't we have that in Denmark?
I'm going even much smaller scale than that. My city, your city, 20 kilometers difference.
Yeah.
It's really a problem.
Yeah. No, I agree. But, you know, there's certain advantages, like I was just reading something, I mean, England has got some of the best genetic databases in the world. And so it's a huge advantage to companies that are developing drugs where the molecular profile is important. And so there's real strengths that's the key things. Identify your strengths and build on your strengths. This issue about how do you deal with underdeveloped areas is a whole nother dilemma. But we do know it doesn't work to spread your money evenly and give as much of it to Poland as you give to Belgium. You're never going to get anything. Its clusters are really the way economies function. So ideally, you would like a different kind of a cluster in Poland around some other sector. Like in Germany, obviously, it's all the whole transportation sector. And hopefully, they will get the electric batteries and all that. Really, that sector will take off.
Of course, with specialization comes risk. If all of a sudden the more specialized industry goes under, then,
Well,
so you need some kind of insurance system that will make sure that.
It's just like the age-old thing about what happened in Belgium and the coal and steel industry goes down. What do you do? Anyway, let me just talk a few about some political obstacles to industrial policy in the U.S. So in principle, there's broad support, but in fact, there's opposition. So conservatives on the right side, right into the spectrum, they are in favor of industrial policy, but they don't like taxes and they don't like government. So that's a problem right there. So they're going to vote. They voted against a lot of President Biden things. The populists, of which they're on the left and the right, there's a lot of anti-corporate sentiment, just anti-big. And this is part of vaccine hesitancy. This is they don't trust the government. They don't trust the National Institute of Health. Dr. Fauci, the head of the I3h COVID thing, is both the most loved and the most hated man in America. Liberals. They don't really, they look carefully about consumer protection. They don't care about innovation. And progressives on the left, they don't like any money going to government corporations. That's bad. And so all of those, for different reasons, gum up this thing. This is what China does not have a problem. They're like, everybody is doing the same thing, which is building China. That's what we're doing here.
Which of course has its own shortcomings if they are in the wrong direction.
Well, that's right. No, we see it right now.
It's not to.
Yeah.
When
an autocratic country makes a mistake, they don't have a self-correcting mechanism. And that's what's happening right now in China and in Russia in its own way. It's like they don't get that signals of how to turn around. Okay. So, and then some of the implementation, several of it. One of the problems is, what are you really trying to achieve with industrial policy? Because some say we want to have a new innovation, a new technology. Others say, well, no, we want to create high-wage jobs. Well, those aren't necessarily the same thing, because a lot of innovation actually produces employment because it automates it out. There's this question about, does the public sector really have the administrative capacity to identify, invest, and implement these technological initiatives? DARPA does because it's military, and they've got a really strong goal of military. And with COVID, it was really clear, vaccine, okay? But, and even with COVID, they're really good at developing the vaccine and really bad on diffusing the vaccine, right? We were talking earlier about the difference between vaccine and vaccination. The vaccination was, could this all be captured by powerful central?
I can see a difference between COVID vaccine on the one hand and defense in general. First of all, COVID vaccines were developed to be used, and they were used very, very fast. Defense, of course, you hope not to have to use them, right? And often you don't.
Well, America's always doing wars, right? That's one thing we're good at. Like the Ukraine right now is based on DARPA. If Ukraine still exists, it's because of DARPA, the technology.
At the same time, you have also serendipity.
Yeah,
I mean, the internet and GPS, I would think that the main uses have been civil.
Yeah. That's right.
And that's why DARPA is really useful.
Yeah. Oh, it's the spillover. It's the spillover.
Yeah. So if we get away from topics like defense or vaccines, your previous slide is basically arguing in favor of a sovereign fund, where you just stash money and you say invest innovations. And politicians cannot interfere with that. They just need to put money and sovereign. That's
Right.
seems to be a solution to your
Right, and the
conundrum.
question is that politically feasible? Can that happen in a democracy that they won't interfere?
In Norway they do, but they have
And
control.
so, we'll see. Once again, it's a combination. It's really the amount of new legislation, industrial legislation adopted in the past 2 years by the Biden administration is actually remarkable. When the U.S. the political process is so gridlocked and so so partisan, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's like 4 major pieces of legislation, all of which have innovation as a real heart of them. And so this fear of China really is focusing people's attention on this. It's fear of China plus it's the issue of, oh my God, America is losing all the best industries and we can't base the economy on agriculture and tourism. Right? It just doesn't work. It's not enough. Those are good, but that's not enough. And so we need to retain. We have made this massive investment in the university science world. We need to get the commercial payback. And it's the same question in Europe. Europe can't be. Like the chairman Xi, I'm going to pronounce it right, of China says, Europe is a place where in the future Chinese couples will go for their honeymoon. Very pretty, very beautiful, but all the real production is going to be in China.
At the same time, the EU still has, if you're talking about mercantilism, the EU still has a current account surplus, while the US has a current account deficit. This has been so for decades. Of course, it has to do with Germany and the fact that, of course, you have German car production and the like everywhere.
Selling to China. No, that's right. No, there's a whole variety of strengths in the European industrial ecosystem, and it's the matter of maintaining the strengths and then filling the weaknesses or remediating the weaknesses. So the other fears are that industrial policy is really just protectionism, which protects producers against consumers. Consumers end up, if now we're saying that you have to build electric batteries in America, well, the costs of that are going to be higher than doing it in China. There's just no question about it. So the cost of iPhones is going to go up. The cost of everything is going to go up. And then mercantilism is the fear that we were talking about that earlier. European firms are discussing moving to the U.S. And so there's strains and stresses in that. And remember the traditional Washington consensus, which is that free trade, small government, private sector dominant, really was very successful in generating the prosperity of the past several decades. And the problem is that prosperity wasn't evenly spread. Okay, and so you really see.
But it did allow poor countries to become emerging countries in that sense.
Yeah, no, it was the greatest reduction in inequality in the history of the world. You see the trends in mortality.
Within the US or within Europe, it's not that great, especially
Yeah. So, but I think actually I didn't put it on the slide, but I think one of the biggest challenges is what I call the diffusion of focus. And if you read Mazzucato stuff, for example, or others, they say, well, what are you trying to do with your industrial? Well, they say if you take public money, you've got to have low prices, you've got to have decarbonized, you've got to create jobs at high wages, you've got to do this, you 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 got to do this. Well, as if there's no trade-offs. You know what I mean? And you're not going to be successful competing against the Chinese if you do all of these other things at the same time. So there's this fear that it's a Christmas tree. We call it Christmas tree. That every stakeholder group says, "Oh yes, we're in favor of industrial policy, but the recipients of the money also have to do what we care about most, which is, let's say, put a center in my hometown." Or which is we need to have a certain number of the jobs are reserved for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all that, those goals can be all very good, but they then will blunt the impact of this on technology. Okay, and then you're just in social policy at that point. And then it's kind of like, well, do you want to put the money into this industrial policy or into pensions or into the social security system or into the university system or the, you know, I mean, you're just into that. So I think that and then even within ARPA, each patient advocacy organization wants the focus to be on their disease, right? So the lobbying is intense, right? And the money could go to not to the most greatest need, but to the most organized political patient. Something that we in America have. Patient advocacy organizations are very well organized and very powerful,
and quite often instrumentalized by foreign behind them.
Oh yeah, subsidized by pharma, by the, you know, absolutely.
How do you, I mean, when you compare US and Europe, because Europe we have our own problems, political system, and right now, by the way, there is a big scandal about the for small issue, the World Cup and so on. Qatar having kind of both influence in European Parliament, very embarrassing. But you know, small issues in comparison to the big picture. But in the US, the influence of lobbies, and particularly industrial lobbies, but not only, on politicians is huge. Is that to what extent is that a problem? Is that oh no? I mean, when you look at, for example, sometimes it's really awful, like you know, the opioid crisis. When you see how so many companies managed to while there were tens of thousands of deaths, nothing happened. So here, is that a major problem or not? As you say, Biden seems to have done wonders.
Well, this is the age-old question. People on the liberal or left side, by the way, Americans use the word liberal to mean social democrat, right? On the left, say that, oh yes, there's too much influence of the big corporate lobbying and donations on government, and that they really influence government. And that traditionally, of course, you know, of course, have a lot of huge influence. But when you look at the political context today, it's remarkable how much anti-corporate sentiment there is on the left and on the right. I mean, Donald Trump was anti-corporate. You cannot say he was an instrument of big business at all, okay? And he was anti-pharma, absolutely. And then now he's, you know, hopefully gone. But a lot of the right wing is very there. They hate Google, they hate Facebook, they hate all these big companies. And then on the left, there's also a lot of anti-corporate. So corporate America is still in there, you know. But this legislation on drug regulation, drug pricing, that wasn't favored by pharma. That was not pharma's thing. So I think that it's
jury's out.
Yeah, I think jury's out, and I actually don't think it's the major political problem facing the United States is industry lobbying. I think the major political problem is the partisanship, which prevents decision making of any kind. And there has been some success. Biden did get a few things through, barely by one vote, you know, each time by one vote. But we have a lot of problems: climate change, technology, education, demographic, aging of the population, opioid, homelessness. Each of those are real problems that need real solutions, legislative solutions, and that requires that the legislature be able to do long-term planning and make trade-offs and be coherent, right? And when they're just yelling at each other about, you know, this crazy stuff that they're yelling at each other about, it's very hard to do that. And that's my greatest fear, that we spend a lot of time on what we call culture wars and things like that, and we never get to. We should all be focused on climate issues, right? And shouldn't we all really be focused on that? You know, as the number one thing facing the world, as those are macro ecological challenges. But in fact, those get pushed aside because we've got much more immediate things that are. You know. So anyway, I don't want to.
IRA was a climate bill.
Yeah. So a number of things really got in there. You notice he didn't call it that. He called it inflation reduction because that's what the public cares about is inflation. The public cares about three things: inflation, immigration, and crime. That's what the voters really care about. And so it's hard to it's hard if you want to. Yeah,
even
yeah, that's right. Yeah, we have full employment.
even if the midterms were.
Yeah. So anyway, we're about to hit our limit our time. I just want to kind of wrap this thing up. As you can see, I'm better at describing the problem than solving it, as is everybody actually. But I do think that we are entering we've been entering a fundamental change in economic policy in the United States and elsewhere in the favor of more direct public support for industry, particularly in the technology industries, of which the life sciences are one, not the only one, but they are one. And that is so that when we talk about healthcare, the usual discussions in healthcare will be, yes, it benefits the patient, but it costs money to society, and how should we balance those? Affordability and access. It's cost effectiveness, HEOR, all that. And that's all true. It's all important. But now there's this third element, which is how does this affect the larger economy, the spillovers into other sectors, the return on investment on the university system, military spillovers, competition with China. Those are all issues that are now in the mix, and that I think it behooves all of us that are in the world of health policy, health economics, health management, health care, health innovation to factor that into our thinking. That's what I'm going to be doing. Look forward to keep staying in touch on that. It also has pricing implications, which we did not get into, but with I3h and all that, all of this has implications on that. And so I think that I would like to wrap this up. 5 minutes to.
Thank you.
Okay,
Excellent.
so thank you.
Questions?
And last Is there a chat?
Is there a comment on the chat? Anyway, this idea that in healthcare, innovation is more and more important. That's of course music to our ears. I3h.
Yes,
We are
yes,
about healthcare.
So you've got the right name. Everything's about innovation. You know, we go from one buzzword to the next. It used to be back then it was managed competition, then it was consumerism, and then it was value. Today it's innovation. It's the word of the words last for about 5 years, and we'll be on to something else.
So, thank you. Are there? Hilda have a question. Are there price caps comparable to EC price cap on gas possible in the pharma sector? In your opinion? What would price caps of the final products? Could they help? Or,
Price caps.
Yeah.
Price caps on drugs.
Yeah.
Because
in Europe today, the gas market is not worldwide, natural gas, and so we have these huge prices, which, by the way, is a key problem for energy-intensive manufacturing in Europe. So the European Commission has decided a very soft maximum price, saying, markets don't necessarily work well. They're very volatile in gas. So the question is here, if indeed, I guess it's connected to what has happened in Medicare, the fact that the companies can decide on the price, and Medicare is not allowed except for this couple of drugs now in the IRA. Now, would a price cap of some sort be a way? So you can do it as long as you don't go beyond that particular cap. Question.
Well, we're so far from that. We in the United States are so far from that way of thinking. The whole notion that you would put a cap for because we have multiple insurers, right? And so say that none of them can pay more than X. It's not even on the agenda. The real question is, well, what should Medicare pay? Because that's the public sector. And so they do want to put caps on what Medicare will pay. And although that doesn't resolve the question about, well, if that's below, if that means that the rate of return on investment for the industry is below their thresholds, will they disinvest in that sector? They could raise prices elsewhere. In the United States, they would raise prices in the private sector, private insurance companies, which, by the way, is what they think everybody thinks they're going to do. Is that because of the Medicare legislation, they raise the price in the private sector. Donald Trump hopes that they would raise prices in Europe, right? That's the solution. Lower prices in America, higher prices in Europe. So I guess implicitly that my view is that the overpricing problem, with a few exceptions of a few orphan conditions, is being resolved by competition in the specialty drug market. I actually think that I believe that that's true, and that actually my interest is on the flip side is to say if the pharma, particularly the startups, are not getting enough investable money, finance, can we replace that with public funding in a way that's intelligent? And not a Christmas tree of it doesn't have to be in every town and country. Can we do that? Are we capable of doing that outside of a pandemic? We could do it in a pandemic. That was good. That was a test case. We can do it in a pandemic. Can we do it in non-pandemic contexts?
Possibly through equity stakes. So
yes, that would be
getting part of the upside.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Final question from Sofia Amaral Garcia, with whom we did some work on having EU products. So first of all, what a fascinating talk. Thank you. I would be curious to know how you will assess whether investment is too high or too low in biotech. Very good question.
Well, in an ideal world, investors would first fund projects with the highest marginal return, and then they would go next level down, then they would go next level down. So as you put in more money, the marginal rate of return goes down because of this natural process. Do they do that? It's unclear. There are those that say if prices go down in the US market and therefore profits go down globally, and therefore the global biopharmaceutical industry invests less in R&D, that's not a problem because they will invest less in the low return therapeutic domains. You can believe that or not believe that. That's one argument that we have too much investment today. So that there's one argument that we have actually too much investment. The other counter argument is that the social rate of return on investment in technology, including in healthcare, is huge. And COVID is the best example. You know what I mean? What is the return on the social return on investment in the COVID? It's just zillions, right? If we didn't have vaccines today, where would we be? What would be we may be underinvesting in Alzheimer's and other diseases of aging and antibiotics, obviously. That's the obvious test case. Other vaccines, and then other technologies that we don't really even understand. Some of these platform technologies or genomic applications or things of that nature. There are those that say that more investment is better investment. More investment is good. And therefore that the problem is not that we're spending too much, but maybe that we're spending too little drugs and devices and digital therapeutics and, the whole thing. How we should balance that between prices and equity investments and tax incentives and all the different instruments. That's another question. And it's an interesting question, but I'm personally interested. But I guess I've been convinced, I have allowed myself to be convinced that the social rate of return of investment in the life sciences is very high, and that therefore we should keep on going down that path.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a last small point, and then we have to go because we're already 2 minutes after 2. I think there is an issue, it has been documented. For example, that for cancer medicine, Me-Toos are much more profitable than real innovation. And there is a very nice paper by Andrew Lowe and some others, because the FDA has this fast track procedure for really important things. And see, you make a lot more money if you're not fast track. That I think is a problem. So, because there is the overall level of investment of R&D, and then the allocation. But anyway, so let me, since we're already a bit above 2 o'clock, let me thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and thanks to everybody online and on site for the questions. So let me, let's applaud you.
That's right.